The sun was sinking low behind the hills, casting a haunting amber light over the old school's narrow windows. St. Martin's Academy, a building now hollow and forsaken, had once been the pride of the small town. The tall brick structure loomed over the barren landscape, its arched windows staring blankly, as though they remembered the laughter and footsteps of children that once filled its halls. But now, for nearly a decade, the school had remained closed, a silent giant presiding over a patch of land no one dared to cross after dusk. Each Halloween, rumors would ripple through town, stories of a night gone wrong, tales of voices echoing from the empty walls, of shadows that seemed too real, and a child's faint whisper calling from the schoolyard. They said that years ago, a prank, innocent, they thought, had left a child missing. She'd fallen into an abandoned cistern just outside, on the edge of the school's pocked and cracked courtyard, disappearing from the world without a sound. For teenagers, bound more by curiosity than by friendship, found themselves standing before the gates that evening. They were dressed in their Halloween costumes, but the usual thrill had faded into an unsettling curiosity. Jack, their unofficial leader, was the first to push open the rusted gates, feeling the sharp chill of the wind bite his cheeks as they entered. He was the one who had first brought up the story, the one who'd whispered to his friends that they had to be brave enough to uncover the truth. "Look," whispered Emily, her voice barely more than a breath. She was staring at the far side of the courtyard, where the outline of a shallow, circular stone wall barely protruded from the ground. "That's where it happened, isn't it? The cistern?" None of them spoke. Jack simply nodded, leading the way. The remaining sunlight cast the courtyard in an eerie twilight, shadows stretching and twisting across the broken concrete. They took each step with the solemnity of a procession, the echoes of their footsteps filling the night air. When they reached the edge of the cistern, silence hung heavy around them. For a moment, they could hear nothing but their own breathing. Jack knelt and peered into the dark void, half expecting to see a face staring back. But there was nothing, only an empty blackness that swallowed the fading light. Suddenly, a chill surged through the group. Behind them, a faint, silvery figure appeared, a shape that looked almost like a child, standing in the center of the courtyard. The figure was small, unsteady on its feet, as if caught between the real and something beyond. It held out its hand toward them, in a chill that was colder than the autumn night wrapped around them, freezing them in place. Without words, they each felt the same pull, an invitation, perhaps a dare. The shadow of the child beckoned them, waiting for their answer. The figure didn't move, yet something about it seemed to draw them closer, as though it had reached into their minds and woven itself there. Jack took a step forward, almost involuntarily. The others hesitated, glancing between him and the shadow, torn between reason and the strange pull that had settled over them. It was Emily who spoke first, her voice as small and quiet as a whisper. "Jack, maybe we shouldn't. This place, it doesn't feel right." She looked back toward the gate, but the idea of retreat felt like surrendering to something even darker. Jack swallowed hard, his heart beating with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "It's just a shadow," he said, his voice trying to sound steady. "Maybe it's nothing. Just reflections." But in his heart, he felt it wasn't. He remembered the stories told around campfires, the whispers of townspeople who claimed to have seen a little girl wandering the courtyard on Halloween night, each tale unfinished, never fully told. And now, standing there, he felt as though they had crossed an unseen threshold into a world that wasn't quite theirs. The figure beckoned again, stepping backward, seeming to float across the ground rather than walk. Its outstretched hand curled into a familiar gesture, a game, a child's invitation. Something about it was disturbingly playful, yet hollow, as if it could barely remember the joy it once brought. "Let's just see," Jack insisted, glancing back at his friends. The fear was a shared burden now, and he didn't want to bear it alone. Maybe it's just a trick, like someone's setting this up to scare us. His voice betrayed him, though. Even he didn't believe it. Catherine, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, clutching her jacket tightly. She had always been the quietest of their group, often swept up in their bravado but cautious all the same. Now, her eyes were wide, her lips pressed together as though she feared even a whisper would break something fragile. But she stayed close, her presence a silent promise that she wouldn't leave them. As the figure led them further into the courtyard, each felt a growing unease, like stepping into a place that had not felt human presence for years. The stones beneath their feet were rough, broken by age, yet the shadow glided over them effortlessly, seeming to grow clearer with each step. The figure stopped abruptly, just a few yards from the cistern, and turned to face them fully. They could now make out details they hadn't before, the faintest outline of a face, hollowed eyes that seemed to stare right through them, and a small, wavering smile that held neither joy nor sorrow, but something else entirely. It was Jack who finally broke the silence. What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, a soft, whispering laugh seeming to slip from nowhere. It raised one finger, pointing downward to the earth, to a spot that lay between them and the cistern, worn bare and scuffed by time. The four of them followed its gaze, breath held, and saw what they hadn't noticed before, faint, scratched markings in the dirt, as though someone had written them long ago. The words were faint, nearly erased by time and weather, but as they crouched closer, they saw they formed a single question, a phrase that trembled with something ancient and unsettling. "Do you want to play with me?" It was Emily who first understood, her voice trembling as she spoke. It's like a game," she whispered, though her voice carried the finality of something much more than a game. "She wants us to play." Emily's words settled among them, a thin layer of frost on the air. None of them dared speak, the stillness thick and unyielding. The shadowy figure, a faint and flickering outline, tilted its head, almost expectantly, as if awaiting their decision. They were no longer merely exploring, they were participants, bound by an invisible thread to the child who had once fallen, lost to this place. It was Jack who spoke first, his voice low, almost inaudible. "What if we just say no? Just leave?" The others exchanged glances, their breaths visible in the cooling night air. Yet the question seemed to hang in the space between them, a fragile refusal against the lure of the figure's haunting, silent gaze. None of them moved. In a strange way, Jack felt almost responsible. He had led them here, after all, and now he felt tethered to this mysterious figure, almost as if to turn back would be to turn his back on something important, something that had waited far too long. "Well," he murmured, "it's Halloween, right?" The bravado in his tone was barely a shadow of its former self, a thin veil of courage worn threadbare by the presence of the figure. "We're here for a little scare, aren't we?" Emily, Catherine, and Tom looked at him, uncertain, but they nodded, each feeling the invisible pull of the game. The figure raised its hand, pointing back toward the cistern, that dark, ancient opening now more visible as the last of the twilight vanished. Beneath the shadow's gesture, the cistern seemed more alive somehow, as if something waited within it, listening, watching. In silence, they formed a loose circle around the figure, their eyes fixed on its ethereal form. The shadow's head tilted, and with a childlike gesture, it lifted its hand to its face and covered its eyes, like a child in a game of hide-and-seek. The meaning was clear. "Count to 10, Tom murmured, his voice brittle with nerves. The air felt heavier with each breath, thick and charged with a suspense they could almost touch. Jack took a deep breath, counting aloud as his friends closed their eyes, whispering the numbers under their breath, each voice a shiver against the night. 1, 2, 3. The words felt hollow, the numbers reverberating in their minds, in the cold air, in the distant echo of footsteps that seemed to hover just beyond the edge of hearing. Their eyes remained shut, but behind their closed lids, they each imagined that shadow standing, watching them count. As Jack reached 10, he opened his eyes, blinking in the sudden darkness. The shadow was gone. They were alone in the courtyard, the cistern now dark and foreboding at their feet. There was no sign of the figure, only the faint outline of disturbed dust where it had stood. "Is it gone?" Catherine asked, her voice little more than a breath. Jack shrugged, his heart hammering as he tried to muster a casual smile. Maybe it was just some trick of the light. But just as he said the words, a whisper crept through the air, brushing against their ears, unmistakably close. "Find me." They all froze, their breath stilled. The voice was neither childlike nor adult. It was something in between, a tone that sounded distant yet intimate, lingering on the edge of their hearing. And with that whispered command, they knew the game had truly begun. The whisper lingered in the air, stretching thin like mist, and then vanished. The four friends stood motionless, glancing nervously at each other, unsure if they truly heard it or if it was merely a trick of their strained minds. Yet each of them had felt it, the ghostly request, an invitation that demanded their attention. Jack took a deep breath, his voice shaky. Maybe we should look around. See if there's anything to, find." They spread out, moving cautiously through the courtyard, their footsteps muted against the damp, uneven ground. The weight of the silence pressed down on them, broken only by the occasional rustle of dry leaves or the echo of a footstep. Emily approached the cistern, peering cautiously over the edge. The opening was dark, the scent of stale earth rising from its depths, mingling with the faint smell of something metallic. She shivered, feeling the pull of the deep, shadowy pit and the secrets it held. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a faint glint in the darkness, perhaps the gleam of a forgotten object. "Guys," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something down there." The others gathered around her, peering over the edge. Jack, summoning his courage, took out his phone and shone its dim light into the cistern. The beam barely reached the bottom, casting only a faint glow over the worn stones, but enough to reveal a small object nestled in the mud, a button, tarnished and frayed, with a faint glimmer of silver at its edges. "Is that?" Catherine's voice trailed off, her face pale in the ghostly light. Jack crouched down, stretching his hand as far as he dared to try and reach the button. His fingers grazed its edge, feeling its smooth surface, and with a small tug, he managed to lift it from the muck. He held it up, the light glinting off its surface, revealing an intricate design, tiny etched flowers surrounding a single letter, M. "What does it mean?" Tom asked, his voice barely concealing his nerves. Jack shrugged, feeling a strange familiarity in the tiny object. "Maybe it belonged to whoever's here. Or whoever used to be here." As he spoke, another whisper brushed against them, soft but clear, winding through the air like a thread of smoke. "You're getting closer." They all froze, eyes wide, the thrill of fear pulsing through them. It felt as though the voice was guiding them, a presence unseen but keenly felt. They glanced around the courtyard, now feeling like trespassers, participants in a ritual they hadn't agreed to, in a game they didn't understand. The silence returned, heavier now, as if the school grounds themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Each of them felt it, their hearts pounding, the sharp awareness that they were no longer just themselves, no longer a mere group of friends exploring on a dare. They were players, moving through an ancient, unseen labyrinth of memories and shadows. Emily's eyes flicked to the doors of the main school building, slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. "Do you think "Do you think we're supposed to go in?" No one responded, yet none of them could resist the pull. One by one, they crossed the threshold, stepping inside the dim corridor that stretched before them. The air inside was thick with dust and a scent of old books, worn wood, and something faintly sweet, almost like dried flowers. Jack pocketed the button, its cool weight in his hand both comforting and ominous. As they moved forward, he kept glancing down at it, tracing the letter M with his thumb. It felt strange, foreign, yet somehow significant, as if it were a key to unlocking something long buried. In the shadows, their footsteps echoed against the floorboards, each creak a reminder of the age and emptiness of the building. The silence pressed closer, thicker, a suffocating presence that seemed to hold them in place. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of children's laughter, somewhere in the distance, a soft, eerie giggle that lingered just out of reach, leading them deeper into the darkness. The laughter died away as quickly as it had come, leaving only the steady, muffled thud of their footsteps echoing through the long, dark hallway. They glanced at each other, fear written in every gaze, but none of them spoke. To turn back now felt as impossible as moving forward, and so they drifted onward, letting the shadows guide them deeper into the bowels of the old school. The hallway opened into a wider room, dimly lit by slivers of moonlight filtering through cracked, dusty windows. They recognized it immediately, one of the old classrooms, its chalkboards still bearing faint traces of half-erased lessons. Desks stood in rigid rows, scattered with forgotten scraps of paper, chalk fragments, and bits of frayed fabric. Jack stepped in first, his eyes scanning the room. Everything felt strangely untouched, frozen in a moment from years ago. Emily trailed behind him, her gaze drawn to the chalkboard where faint scribbles were still visible in the chalk dust. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface, and paused. "Look," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A small, crudely drawn heart was etched into the board, with 2 sets of initials scrawled inside, MG and LB. "Do you think—" Catherine began, but stopped, the thought too strange to finish. The initials matched the letter on the button, as if confirming that whoever had once been in this room had left pieces of themselves here, scattered like breadcrumbs. Tom moved closer to the rows of desks, his curiosity winning over his fear. On one of the desks, he spotted a small bundle, a worn notebook, edges frayed, bound with a faded ribbon. It seemed oddly out of place, too neat amid the dust and decay, as if it had been carefully left there for them to find. "Hey, guys, take a look at this." Tom's voice broke the silence, drawing them all closer. He carefully untied the ribbon and opened the notebook, revealing a child's handwriting, messy and looping. The words were barely legible, smudged and faded with age. But they could make out a few sentences. October 31st. Today, we play the game. I saw her again, by the cistern. She says I can't tell anyone, but it's okay. I promised. A shiver ran through them all, and Jack felt a cold prickle down his spine. "Who's she?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered, but the silence seemed to swell, pressing in from all sides. The faint scent of dried flowers lingered, and in that quiet, Jack thought he could almost hear the sound of chalk scratching against the board, slow and deliberate. He turned, glancing at the chalkboard once more. The heart with the initials was still there, but below it, fresh words were scrawled in a jagged, uneven hand, "Join us." A chill crept through Jack, seeping into his bones. He turned to the others, who were now watching him with wide, frightened eyes. He could tell by their expressions that they saw it too, the same ghostly writing that seemed to appear without a sound, as if the hand that wrote it was unseen, still lingering somewhere just out of sight. Emily clutched her arms, shivering. It's as if they want us to finish something, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Something they started. The faint sound of laughter drifted through the room again, sending goosebumps prickling across their skin. Jack felt an inexplicable sense of dread mixed with curiosity, a sensation he could barely name but couldn't ignore. Somewhere in the shadows, he was certain something was watching them, waiting. At that moment, they heard it, a soft, steady tap, 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 like the sound of small fingers drumming against wood. They turned in unison, their eyes drawn to the doorway, where the faint silhouette of a child lingered, half hidden in the shadows. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them, then turned and drifted down the hall, disappearing into the darkness. None of them spoke, but as if drawn by an invisible thread, they followed, each step pulling them deeper into the mystery that seemed to pulse at the heart of the old school, binding them to a game that felt older than memory itself. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each shadow casting a darker gloom over their path. The air grew heavier, filled with a strange chill that bit at their skin, seeping through their jackets and clinging to their bones. They followed the faint, shuffling sound ahead, never quite catching up to the figure that led them, but always close enough to feel its pull. Emily glanced around nervously, her hand brushing against the wall for reassurance. Beneath her fingers, she felt odd carvings, rough and shallow, etched into the surface of the walls, small symbols and strange marks that seemed to form a pattern. She shivered, pulling her hand away, but the sensation lingered, a faint buzzing that settled into her fingertips. "Do you see those?" she whispered, motioning toward the carvings. The others nodded, their faces pale and tense, eyes darting between each flickering shadow. Jack approached one of the carvings, running his hand lightly over the shape of what looked like an eye, open and staring. The pattern of symbols formed a path, leading toward an old, faded wooden door at the end of the hallway. It was the sort of door that looked as if it hadn't been opened in years, yet here it was, ajar, its hinges creaking faintly as if inviting them inside. They hesitated, but the shadowy figure appeared again, standing just outside the doorway, watching them with a stillness that felt almost alive. Its face was obscured, a blur in the dim light, but its presence was unmistakable. The figure turned and drifted into the room beyond the door, leaving the air thick with expectation. "Do we follow?" Catherine's voice was barely a whisper, but the question hung between them, as palpable as the cold. Jack nodded, swallowing hard. "It feels like we have to." With bated breath, they crossed the threshold into a room bathed in a ghostly half-light. The walls were lined with dusty cabinets, filled with relics of a forgotten past, frayed books, glass jars, and odd trinkets that seemed misplaced in a school. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something faintly sweet, almost like decayed flowers. In the center of the room lay a circle, crudely drawn in chalk. Inside, faint lines traced the shapes of 4 small figures holding hands. Each figure had initials scratched beside it, MG, LB, and 2 more letters too faded to read. They stared at the circle, an inexplicable dread settling over them. It felt like a memory frozen in chalk, a moment captured and left untouched, waiting for something, or someone, to complete it. Jack stepped forward, his voice barely a murmur. "It's a game, some sort of game they used to play." Emily frowned, her face pale. "A binding game, something to keep them here." As she spoke, the faint sounds of children's voices drifted through the room, laughter and whispers weaving together in an eerie harmony. The circle seemed to pulse with energy, the chalk lines almost glowing in the dim light. Jack's gaze fell on the initials, and he reached into his pocket, feeling the button with the letter M. It felt warm now, almost as if it were responding to the circle. He looked up at the others. Maybe if we finish it, if we do what they did, they'll let us go." Catherine's eyes widened. And if they don't? A silence fell, thick and stifling, but the answer was clear to each of them. The figure of the child appeared again, now standing just outside the circle, its hand outstretched as if inviting them to join. The small figure wavered, flickering in and out like a candle in the wind, but its message was clear. One by one, they stepped forward, joining hands as they mimicked the circle drawn on the floor. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing closer, the air thickening with an almost unbearable tension. They felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them, the pressure of something vast and ancient pressing down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the whisper returned, soft but sharp, each word etching itself into their minds. "You will remember us." The chalk circle beneath their feet glowed faintly, and the sensation was dizzying, a strange pull that seemed to blend past and present, binding them to the room, to the game, and to the shadowy figures that lingered in the corners of their minds. Jack felt his hand grow colder, as if another hand, unseen and icy, had taken hold of his. The voices grew louder, filling the room with laughter and cries, weaving together in a sound that was almost beautiful, almost comforting, until it wasn't. The laughter turned sharp, discordant, echoing through the room with an edge that made their skin crawl. Suddenly, the grip on Jack's hand loosened, and he staggered, breaking free from the circle. The others did the same, breathless and trembling, their eyes wide with fear. The room fell silent. The chalk circle lay undisturbed, but they all felt the strange heaviness that lingered, as if they had left a part of themselves behind. The shadowy figure by the door vanished, leaving only the empty room, quiet and waiting, as if it held secrets it would never tell. They stumbled back into the hallway, feeling the pull of the exit now, an overwhelming urge to escape the cold, empty corridors. As they reached the doors and looked back, they could almost see the outline of children's shadows lingering near the cistern, watching them with silent, waiting eyes, as if the game was not yet finished. As they left the school, the cool night air hit them like a shock, dispersing the shadows that had clung to them inside. They staggered onto the lawn, each of them pale and silent, and the old building loomed behind them, dark and solemn. They felt its gaze even as they looked away, as though the empty windows held a memory of something that hadn't yet happened, waiting for them to acknowledge it. Emily turned to Jack, her face ashen. Did it feel like we brought something with us?" Her voice trembled, barely audible over the rustling wind. Jack said nothing, but he gripped the button in his pocket tightly, feeling its cold, smooth edge against his palm. The night felt heavier now, the weight of the encounter settling over them, refusing to fade. "Maybe we imagined it," Catherine whispered, more to herself than to the others, her gaze locked on the towering structure. The words sounded hollow, but they all clung to them, desperate for an explanation that felt safer than the truth. Yet, as they began to walk down the gravel path leading away from the school, Jack noticed something strange. Their footsteps no longer echoed alone. Instead, a soft pattering joined them, light and quick, as if someone small was following, running to keep up. He turned abruptly, but there was nothing there, just the empty yard, littered with brittle leaves that shifted in the breeze. He let out a shaky breath, shaking his head at his own nerves, yet the feeling lingered, clawing at the edge of his thoughts. "Let's just go," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The walk back into town was silent, each of them wrapped in the weight of what they'd seen. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, stretching their forms along the cracked pavement, and the quiet houses seemed to watch them with an unsettling awareness. Every now and then, Jack thought he heard the faint sound of laughter, so quiet that he could almost convince himself it was the wind. They parted ways at the edge of town, each heading home with the quiet dread clinging to them, though none of them mentioned it. Jack reached his house, the warmth of the familiar surroundings offering no comfort, and headed straight for his room, desperate to escape into sleep and leave the night behind. But as he lay in bed, the darkness pressed closer, heavy and thick, and sleep refused to come. The silence in his room grew oppressive, almost loud, as if it held a presence of its own, watching, waiting. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt distorted, twisted. Jack lay awake, his thoughts spiraling, and just as he began to drift off, he heard it, a faint whisper, familiar and unsettling, drifting through the dark. "You will remember us." He sat up, heart pounding, but the room was empty, undisturbed. His eyes darted around, seeking any movement in the shadows, yet he saw only the quiet stillness of his room. Shivering, he lay back down, forcing his eyes shut, trying to block out the lingering sensation. The next morning, Jack awoke feeling drained, the memory of the previous night clinging to him like a shadow. He met with Emily and Catherine later, their faces reflecting his own sleeplessness, and though they tried to talk about other things, their conversation circled back, drawn to the school as if by some invisible thread. "It feels like they're still with us," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, and neither Jack nor Catherine dared disagree. Days passed, but the feeling didn't fade. Each night, Jack lay awake, listening to the quiet, and each morning he awoke more exhausted, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He noticed things, a shadow flitting at the edge of his vision, laughter in empty rooms, the constant sensation of being watched. And in his pocket, the button grew colder, its surface smooth and unyielding, a reminder he couldn't escape. One evening, as the sun set and the shadows deepened, he returned to the school alone, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The building loomed before him, silent and dark, its windows reflecting the faint glow of the dying light. He stepped onto the grounds, each footfall heavy, echoing through the empty yard. The air was thick, heavy with a familiar, cold presence, and as he approached the old cistern, he felt a chill brush his skin, a whisper drifting through the night. "Play with us." Jack's breath caught, and he turned, his eyes wide, as he saw them, shadows of children, faint and flickering, their faces blurred but their forms unmistakable, waiting for him with outstretched hands. In that moment, he understood. They hadn't finished the game. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, and ran, the whispers following him, chasing him through the darkened yard, growing louder, more desperate. He burst through the gate, fleeing down the empty streets, but the memory of their faces lingered, burned into his mind. As he reached the safety of his house, he collapsed against the door, his breath coming in gasps. But he knew, deep down, that he could never truly leave them behind. The game was unfinished, and they would wait, patient and silent, until he returned to complete it. And in the dark, as he sat there trembling, he could still hear them, their whispers weaving through the night. "You will remember us."